The candles in Lady Vane's ballroom numbered well over 300, and every one of them seemed to find Thomasina Anderson at the moment she crossed the threshold in her sister's remade gown. She had known, as Clara fastened the last of the recut seams that afternoon, that the gown was not quite right. The silk was a pale blue that had suited Clara's warmer complexion, and now made Thea look as though she had been pressed like a flower and forgotten in a book. The hem had been let down and restitched, and the letting down showed if one looked, which everyone in this room was trained to do. The lace at the sleeve was not wrong, precisely. It was only the kind of lace that told a careful observer everything they needed to know about the woman wearing it. Thea walked in anyway. She had been dared to, and she was 22 years old. And she had already survived a great deal worse than this. Clara had laughed when she suggested it, not unkindly. The Duke of Wexford stood near the terrace door at every ball he attended, by all accounts. He spoke to no one unless they spoke first, and no one spoke first, and the arrangement suited the room. Clara had said, on a breath warm with champagne she had accepted from a passing footman, that she would give Thea her pearl earbobs for a full month if she simply walked up to him and said good evening. The pearl earbobs were in Thea's ears now, cold against her jaw in the overheated room. She had not yet crossed to the terrace door. She stood instead at the edge of the parquet, watching Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Wexford, from a distance of perhaps 30 feet, and tried to understand what she had agreed to. He was tall in the specific way that suggested he had been tall since before he learned to mind it, and his face had the stillness of someone who had long ago decided that expression was optional. His coat was dark. His cravat was precisely folded. He held a glass he did not drink from, and his gaze moved across the assembled company with the methodical patience of a man cataloging something he had no particular interest in. Then his gaze reached her, and it stopped. She felt the moment as a physical event, a catch in the room's ordinary motion, and then his eyes moved on as though they had not paused at all, and she was left standing at the edge of the parquet with the pearl earbobs cold at her jaw, and no certainty about what had just happened. She did not know, standing there in Clara's remade gown with the too careful hem and the slightly wrong lace, that she had already been seen. She did not know that the Duke had spent the remaining 40 minutes of that first evening watching her from a disciplined distance, his body very still, and his attention anything but. She knew only that Clara was gesturing from across the room, and she squared her shoulders and walked. To understand how she had come to be there at all, it is necessary to go back 3 weeks. To the morning a letter arrived at the Anderson house in Marylebone, addressed to Miss Thomasina Anderson in the careful hand of Mr. Aldous Briggs, her father's solicitor. Her father had been dead 11 months. He had been a gentleman, a scholarly man, a man who had read Latin for pleasure and kept meticulous records of everything except his finances. The estate he had left behind was a modest house in Hertfordshire, and a debt of £430 that he had somehow contrived to make feel like a secret until the moment it became Thea's problem. Briggs had been patient. He was a small, neat man with ink-stained cuffs who visited twice yearly and delivered news of the debt's particulars with the careful sympathy of someone presenting a terminal diagnosis they had nothing to do with causing. The £430 sat between Thea and any reasonable future, like a wall she could see clearly, but could not find a door in. Clara was 24, and had been engaged the previous spring to a pleasant man with a comfortable income, and no family debts. Clara's engagement had not resolved anything for Thea, who understood clearly that she was now, in the frank language of the marriage market, a woman with no dowry, No connections beyond the moderate ones her father's scholarly reputation had left her, and no particular claim on anyone's attention. She had a good mind and a composed manner, and the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for shyness, and sometimes, more accurately, identified as the careful rationing of energy by someone who had learned not to spend it carelessly. The London season had been Clara's idea. Their aunt kept a house in Marylebone and had offered it without strings, or nearly without strings. There was the matter of the gown. Clara's ball gown from the previous season was pale blue silk, well made, and only very slightly out of fashion. And Clara pressed it on Thea with a warmth that cost her nothing, and Thea a great deal of pride. Thea had remade it herself, restitching the hem and tightening the sleeves, and adding the lace from a collar their mother had left behind. And when she wore it, she knew it was not quite right. And she wore it anyway, because it was the gown she had. The season was not a pleasure for Thea. It was a courtroom, and she understood that she was standing in the dock. Lady Dorothea Vane presided over that courtroom with the confidence of a woman who had never once lost a procedural motion. She was the widow of the late Earl of Vane, a woman of 53, who wore the authority of her position, the way other women wore jewels, as an intrinsic feature of the body rather than an addition to it. She was not cruel in the theatrical sense. She was something more durable than theatrical, which was categorically correct and entirely willing to be unkind in service of correctness. The social order she maintained was, in her view, not a preference, but a fact, and people who threatened that fact did so in ignorance, and it was her duty to educate them. She had identified Thea at the second ball of the season, 2 days after the first. Thea had not heard it directly. Lady Vane had been standing near the entrance with Miss Cecily Pryor at her elbow, Cecily in a white gown threaded with gold that had been made by a Bond Street dressmaker that season and showed it in every seam. Lady Vane had looked at Thea's remade blue silk with an expression of polished, measured sympathy, and had said, quietly enough to be private and loudly enough to carry, that it was kind of Miss Anderson's family to allow her to try the season, given the circumstances. Clara had been standing within earshot. She had relayed it to Thea that night with her jaw set and her hands tight in her lap. Thea had listened and said nothing, and resolved to attend every ball she was invited to. She attended the Harfield Assembly and the Pemberton Supper and the Marchmont debut, and each of them added its particular pressure to the accumulating weight of the season. She danced when she was asked, which was not often, and when she was not asked, she stood at the edge of the room with the composure she had been practicing since she was 15, and she watched. She had always been good at watching. It was one of the skills that the circumstances of her life had developed, with a thoroughness that no school could have managed. It was at the Pemberton supper that she first noticed she was being watched in return. The supper room was crowded and warm, and Thea had slipped into the corridor beyond the main salon to find a moment of quiet. An elderly woman in purple silk was standing near the corridor's far end, visibly distressed, her reticule open in her hands. She was Mrs. Fenton, Thea would learn later, a widow of 70 whose eyesight was failing and whose evening had apparently included losing the contents of her reticule across the corridor floor. The banknotes were there, 15 guineas in folded notes, and several other women had passed without stopping. Thea gathered every note, counted them quietly, replaced them in the reticule, and returned it to Mrs. Fenton's hands with the same care she would have given a thing that mattered. She did not know, until she turned to go back to the supper room, that the Duke of Wexford was standing in the corridor's shadow. He had presumably come from the card room at the corridor's other end. He was very still, and he was watching her with an expression she could not read in the low light. And when she met his eyes, He did not look away, which no one in her experience had ever done. She made her curtsy. He inclined his head. Neither of them said anything, and she walked back into the supper room with the peculiar sensation that something had shifted in the room's architecture, though she could not have named what. He sought her out before the supper ended. She was standing near the window with Clara and their cousin Margaret Finch, a cheerful woman of 30 who collected gossip with the conscientious dedication of a naturalist cataloging beetles, when the crowd at the room's edge parted in the particular way it parted for men of his rank, the quiet, automatic adjustment of bodies that recognized authority at a level below thought. He stood before her and inclined his head again, and said in a voice that was quiet and level and did not ask for anything, that he believed he had not had the pleasure of an introduction. Clara, to her credit, managed the introduction without audible triumph. He listened to it with the focused attention of a man storing information, his eyes on Thea. And when she said it was a pleasant evening, he said, with a gravity entirely disproportionate to the observation, that he had found it more interesting than most. Then he excused himself and was gone. And Margaret Finch began to speculate in an urgent whisper that Clara silenced with a single look. Thea told herself it was courtesy. She had returned a reticule belonging to an elderly woman, and he had been a witness. And he was a duke, and therefore accustomed to rewarding appropriate behavior. She told herself this with such conviction that she very nearly believed it. Her wound had been precise and persistent, built over 2 years of the marriage market's efficient verdict. She was notable for nothing, dowryless and therefore costless and therefore invisible. She did not expect to be chosen. She expected to endure. If you have found your way to this story, you may already know what it is to stand in a room and feel that the room has not yet registered you. Stay with Thea a little longer. The register is coming. The days that followed the Pemberton supper produced a series of encounters she could not quite categorize. He arrived at Lady Morley's garden party and crossed the lawn to stand near her without apparent purpose. He asked Margaret the name of the woman reading under the apple tree, not knowing Margaret would report this immediately and in full to Clara, who reported it in turn to Thea with the manner of someone presenting evidence in a case she had long considered closed. Thea received this information with careful stillness and filed it under the heading of inexplicable. At Lady Morley's party, she had been helping an 8-year-old child retrieve a paper boat that had sailed too far into the ornamental pond, using a gardener's cane that happened to be leaning against the wall, when she realized the child was watching her with the complete unself-conscious trust of very young children, and the child's name given in a breathless introduction. Once the boat was rescued, was Harriet. She learned later that Harriet was the Duke's ward, a girl of 8 whose mother had died when Harriet was 5, and that Harriet was not generally easy with strangers. She learned it from Harriet herself, who appeared at Thea's side at the next 2 events they both attended with the determination of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. Harriet had her guardian's eyes, gray and very direct, and she had decided that Thea was interesting, and she said so plainly, which was the most honest compliment Thea had received all season. The Duke watched his ward make this determination from a disciplined distance. When Harriet took Thea's hand during the fireworks at the Ashwell reception, the Duke's expression did something Thea did not see because she was watching Harriet's face, small and delighted in the colored light. If she had looked, she would have seen his jaw ease from the careful set it maintained in public, and something in his eyes settle, like a man who has been holding himself at tension for a long time and has permitted one slow breath. The portrait came to her attention through Harriet as well. Harriet had come to call with the Duke and his housekeeper, a formal visit to Thea's aunt's house in Marylebone that no one had quite expected, and that Clara received with a composed warmth that only Thea recognized as suppressed excitement. Harriet, exploring the small sitting room with the unconstrained curiosity of a child in a new space, had mentioned in passing that there was a portrait in the Duke's study that faced the wrong way. She had said it with the puzzled practicality of childhood, as though the painting's reversed position was simply an error, waiting for correction. The Duke, standing near the fireplace, had gone very still. He had recovered quickly and changed the subject with the authority of a man who had considerable practice at it. Thea had not pressed. She had only noted the stillness and the quality of it, the specific quality of a man containing something that had been reopened by accident. She learned the rest in pieces, the way one learns things one has not been told directly. Harriet's mother had been the Duke's wife, dead 3 years after an illness that came on quickly and did not relent. He had married young and chosen, everyone understood, precisely and deliberately, a woman whose warmth and quickness had been entirely opposite to his own nature, and her death had left a silence in the house that nothing had since filled. The portrait in the study had faced the wall since the first anniversary of her death. He had not been cold before, people said, or not so cold. He had been made cold by something specific, and had been living in that coldness long enough that it had become the fact of him. He had been afraid, Thea came to understand later, of choosing wrongly again. Not of loss, exactly, though loss was in it. He had been afraid of the specific error of trusting his own perception, of believing a person to be one thing and finding the world's verdict reversed by grief. He had been watching her since the first ball. He had been watching her because she was the first person in 3 seasons who had made him uncertain. Lady Vane noticed the accumulation of his attention at approximately the same moment Thea's misreading of it reached its most complete form. The dinner at Vane House was a supper for 32, which was intimate by Lady Vane's standards and enormous by Thea's. She had been invited, Clara was quite certain, because Lady Vane preferred to conduct her operations in environments she controlled. Cecily Pryor sat at Lady Vane's right hand in a rose silk gown that had been delivered from the dressmaker that morning, and the diamonds at her throat were the Pryor family diamonds, which everyone knew had been cleaned and reset for the season with specific purpose. Lady Vane waited until the second course, when the table's conversation had reached its natural distributed hum, and then said, in the carrying tone she used for observations she wished to be widely received, that she had not realized the Duke's charitable attentions this season extended to young women without the means to outfit themselves properly. She said it to the woman on her left, but she said it in the direction of Thea's end of the table, and the women nearest her went briefly, precisely quiet. Thea kept her face composed and her hand still in her lap. Clara, across the table, did not. The table moved on, the conversation redistributing itself as conversations do after a silence, and Thea ate what was placed before her and said the things that were required of her, and did not let the bloom of heat at her throat reach her face. What she did not yet know was that 3 days later, Lady Vane would exceed the bounds of the social authority she had spent 40 years carefully legitimating. The Duke had called twice at Marylebone in the week following the dinner. The first call had been brief and had produced a conversation in the small sitting room about Harriet's lessons, which were going badly in the area of French and rather well in the area of botany, and which the Duke discussed with the focused attention he brought to everything, his eyes occasionally finding Thea's over the small table between them, with a quality that was not polite attention, and that she had not yet allowed herself to name. The second call had ended in the garden, where the last of the autumn roses were going over, and where he had said, in the tone he used for things that cost him something to say, that he had not thought to find the season interesting, and he had been mistaken. She had been very still for a moment, the garden was cool, and the light was going, and she could see the held breath of it in her chest, without knowing quite what to do with the air. She said that she had found it difficult. He said, looking at the roses rather than at her, that he understood difficulty. She believed him. That was the precise problem. She believed him, and she felt the careful walls she maintained around her own expectations develop. For the first time in 2 years, a faint structural uncertainty. She did not allow herself to think further than that afternoon. She had too much practice at endurance to mistake a single afternoon for a foundation. 3 days later, at Lady Pryor's evening reception, she was in the corridor collecting Harriet's dropped glove when Margaret Finch found her with the expression of someone who has news they would rather not carry. Lady Vane had announced in the drawing room before 26 witnesses that the Duke of Wexford and Miss Cecily Pryor had reached an understanding and that the formal engagement would be made public before the month's end. Thea stood in the corridor with Harriet's small glove in her hand and felt the announcement settle over her with the specific, certain weight of a thing she had been waiting for without knowing it. She thought of 2 afternoon calls and a cool garden and a man saying he had been mistaken about the season. She thought of 15 guineas returned to an old woman's hands and a paper boat and a child with gray eyes who had decided she was interesting. She thought of a portrait turned face inward and the care with which he had deflected Harriet's question and the quality of his stillness in the corridor at the Pemberton supper. She returned Harriet's glove to Harriet's hand, smoothed the small fingers closed around it, and went to find Clara. She did not make a scene. She made her farewells with the composure she had been building since 15, said she had a slight headache, which was true, and left the reception with Clara beside her and her spine very straight and her face showing nothing that anyone could accurately report. Clara was quiet in the carriage. Thea was quiet in the carriage. Outside, London moved past in the wet November dark, and the lights of the other carriages made brief patterns on the window glass, and Thea sat with her hands folded in her lap and understood that the choice before her was not complicated. She could continue attending events, continue being courteous, continue pretending that Lady Vane had not just closed the door with precision and finality, and in doing so, she would be enduring in the exact way she had always endured, waiting for the season's machinery to produce some other verdict. Or she could act from her own values, which she had always done at every cost, and do the only honest thing left. She wrote the letter that night by the small lamp in her room, sitting at the plain desk that had been her father's. She wrote it with the care she brought to things that mattered. She told him that she understood the announcement and that she released him from any implied understanding, if any such understanding had existed. She told him she did not require explanation. She told him that she wished him and Miss Pryor well, and she meant it, or she tried to mean it, and she thought that was enough. She signed it Thomasina Anderson, which was the most formal thing she had written in weeks, and she folded it and sealed it and gave it to the footman before she could reconsider. She slept less than she might have wished. In the morning she dressed and came down for breakfast and ate toast with the deliberate composure of someone performing the gestures of a normal day until they become a normal day. Clara watched her across the table with the expression of someone exercising considerable restraint. Thea went on. That was what she did. She had been going on for 11 months since her father died, and she could go on through this as well. She did not know that the letter had arrived at Wexford House that same morning and had been placed on the Duke's desk, and that he had looked at it for a long moment, at the familiar, careful hand on the sealed envelope, and had put on his coat. He had not opened it. Lady Vane's second ball of the season was held on a Friday in late November, when the first cold had settled over London with an honest intention to stay. The house was lit from every window and the carriages queued along the street, and inside the 300 candles were burning again, and the assembled company was the assembled company of the season, which meant that everyone who mattered to anyone present was present to witness whatever happened next. Thea had not intended to come. Clara had argued with a persistence that left no reasonable counter, and Thea had come because refusing would have looked like retreat, and she refused to retreat from a room she had every right to occupy. She wore the pale blue gown again, the remade gown with the let-down hem, and the sleeve lace from her mother's collar, because it was the gown she had, and she was done being ashamed of it. She was standing near the far window with Clara and Margaret when the crowd near the entrance performed its characteristic parting, and the Duke of Wexford came into the room. He was not looking at Cecily Pryor. He was not looking at Lady Vane, who had risen from her chair near the fireplace with the smooth authority of a woman who has been managing these arrivals for 30 years. He was looking across the room with the focused, methodical attention of a man who has misplaced something specific and intends to find it. His eyes found her. He came across the ballroom in 4 strides that covered the distance with a directness that silenced conversation as it passed, the way a stone dropped into still water produces its rings outward in all directions. Margaret made a small sound. Clara's hand found Thea's arm. He stopped before her and reached into his coat and held out the letter she had sent him. It was still sealed. The room had gone very quiet, or Thea's perception of it had, which was functionally the same thing. He said, in a voice that was level and quiet and intended to carry exactly as far as it needed to, that he had not read it, and he did not intend to, and he would like her to tell him in person whatever it contained. Thea looked at the sealed letter in his hand. She looked at the seal she had pressed herself, intact. She looked at his face, which was not still in the way it was usually still. It was still in the way that something is still, when it is holding everything it has. She said quietly that it was meant to release him. He said, looking at her with the gray, direct regard that Harriet had inherited and used with the same unself-conscious precision, that he was not aware of requiring release, and that if she had something to say to him, she had his full attention. And she always had, and she should know that by now. Somewhere near the fireplace, Lady Vane drew a breath that she did not finish. Cecily Pryor went very still at Lady Vane's elbow, and something moved in her face. A recognition, small and quickly managed, of a field she had been moved from. Thea was aware of the room, its 300 candles, its 30-odd witnesses, the particular quality of a silence produced by a social event holding itself in suspension. She was aware of the remade gown and its imprecise hem, and the lace at her sleeve. She was aware that she was 22 years old, and that she had been told, in 100 ways both voiced and structural, that she was not the correct choice, and that the man standing before her with an unsealed letter in his hand had crossed this room in 4 strides with no apparent concern for any of that. She said, in a voice she was proud of, that she was glad to know it. He took her hand then, properly, correctly, in front of every witness the room contained, and turned toward his solicitor, Mr. Aldous Briggs, who had been standing at the edge of the room since before the ball began, a small, neat man with ink-stained cuffs, and who produced a document from his coat, with the efficient calm of a man who has been asked to be prepared for this, and has been. Briggs confirmed it in clear, simple terms. A debt of £430, previously recorded against the estate of the late Mr. Anderson, had been discharged in full 3 days prior, through the Duke's direct instruction, as part of a settlement made in anticipation of a formal understanding. Clara made a sound that was not quite quiet. Lady Vane said nothing. The specific silence she maintained was the particular silence of a woman whose procedural certainty has encountered a limit it had not mapped, and who is intelligent enough to recognize, in this moment, that she has overreached the authority she was given. She sat down and fanned herself once, and said nothing further. This was its own kind of humbling, and more lasting than any louder correction could have been. The ball continued. The musicians played on. The assembled company, after the particular held breath pause that great social events require before they can resumed. People spoke to Thea, who had not spoken to her before, and she received their attention with the grace that had been her only available resource for 2 years, and was now something else, something that belonged to her, rather than serving as a substitute for things she lacked. Margaret collected information with the joyful efficiency of someone who will have much to report in the morning. Clara stood at the edge of the room with tears drying at her lashes, trying not to be obvious about it, and was entirely obvious, and did not mind. Harriet was not at the ball, it being past her bedtime by some hours, but she was told of it in the morning by Mrs. Carew, the housekeeper, who had received a full report from a footman who had been present. Harriet received this information with the satisfaction of a child whose conclusions have been confirmed by events. They were married in December, which gave the season very little time to recover its opinions, though it managed. The 40 miles from London to Wexford Hall passed under a sky that had been threatening snow since morning, and delivered it in the late afternoon, the first proper snowfall of winter, fine and purposeful, settling on the park's bare trees and the gravel of the long drive and the old stones of the house itself with the indiscriminate care of a thing that belongs everywhere it lands. Thea stood at the window of the room that was now her sitting room, watching the snow come down across the park, and thought about the particular quality of arriving somewhere, and finding that the word home applies to it without effort, without the long negotiation she had always assumed that word required. Clara was staying 3 days. She sat by the fire with her feet tucked under her and a cup of tea cooling on the side table, and she was telling a story about Margaret Finch and the Harfield Assembly that required both hands and a small amount of physical demonstration. And Thea was listening with the particular warm attention she gave to things she intended to remember. Edmund came in quietly as he moved through his own house and bent his head to say something into Thea's hair that made her turn and look at him with an expression Clara later described to Margaret as one that settled every question she had ever had about her sister's happiness. He stayed at the window for a moment, and then he crossed to the study. And Thea heard, in the quiet between Clara's story and the fire's settling, the sound of a painting being moved. She knew what it was. She waited, the snowfall continuing its patient work outside the glass, the fire continuing its in the hearth. And a few minutes later he returned and stood in the doorway with the particular stillness she had come to know as its own vocabulary, a language he had been speaking to her since a first ball and a withheld gaze, and she had been learning to read since a corridor and a returned reticule and the direct gray eyes of a child who had decided she was worth knowing. The portrait of his late wife now faced outward in the study, framed by the winter light. It was the right thing. He had known it for some time, she thought, and had been waiting for the moment when it felt like release, rather than erasure. That was the word he would use later. In the quiet of the evening when the house had settled, and Clara had gone to bed and the snow had thickened against the window. Release, he said, and she understood what he meant, which was not that grief ends, but that it finds, eventually, a place to stand that is not in the doorway of every room. She wore the pale blue gown one last time that week, when they sat for the small household gathering Edmund had arranged as an informal welcome. It was still not quite right, and she wore it with a composure that had stopped being armor and become something closer to affection. She would have new gowns. That was simply true now. She would have them made correctly, to her measurement, in whatever color suited her own complexion. She kept the old one folded at the back of the press, the sleeve lace intact, her mother's collar lace still at the cuff. It would stay there because it was the gown she had worn to a ball, with pearl earbobs cold at her jaw, and no certainty about what would happen. And she had walked across the room anyway, and that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with silk or dressmakers, or the opinion of a room. The snow fell over Wexford Hall through the night and into the following morning. And Harriet woke early and came to find Thea before breakfast. And they stood together at the long window and watched it. The park white and still and entirely new. And Harriet's hand was warm in hers, and the world outside the glass was very quiet. And Thea was home. If Thea's journey has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Stories about women who continue, who act from their values when the cost is real, deserve to be kept and passed on. More are coming. Be here for them.